but Jairus at this time forgets all about that. Now we're going to skip over, and we'll come back to this, but we're going to skip over from verse 24 now to verse 35, verse 24 to verse 35. While he was still speaking, there came from the ruler's house someone who said, "Your daughter is dead. Why trouble the teacher any further?" So Jesus is teaching, and Jairus has come to him. Jairus is imploring him to come and help and to try and heal his daughter. And then he has the individual that comes to him while this is going on and says that this daughter has died. Now, it says, but overhearing what they said, Jesus said to the ruler of the synagogue, "Do not fear, only believe." And he allowed no one to follow him except Peter and James and John, the brother of James. They came to the house of the ruler of the synagogue, and Jesus saw a commotion, people weeping and wailing loudly. Now, a funeral was a production. If in this time there were, you would tear your garments at a funeral, they would hire flute players to play, they would, actually you could stop work for 3 days. Instead of having paternity leave, you actually had death leave, and you could stop work for 3 days. There'd be special prayer of mourning, and so there was just a lot of activity that was taking place with this funeral, and all of this was going on at the door of the ruler's house. And Jesus says that she's not dead, she is only sleeping. And it says in verse 40, and they laughed at him, but he put them all outside and took the child's father and mother and those who were with him and went in where the child was. Now, we don't know why Jesus just took Peter, James, and John with him. There doesn't seem to be any indication in any scripture other than the fact that they were part of his inner circle of apostles and that he wanted to especially have them with him, but we don't know why. So we see that he got rid of the mourners, and then he says, taking her by the hand, he said, Talitha Kumi, which means, little girl, I say to you, arise. Now, Talitha Kumi is in Aramaic. The rest of this was written in Greek. Now, why do you think that they would have this in Aramaic language rather than the Greek language, which the rest of the narrative is written in? Any idea? Okay, that's what he actually said. Anyone want to add on to this a little bit? How many of you started out with a different language than English? Anybody here that started out with a different language than English? Okay, so that, now I grew up in a home in which we spoke Plautitsch, which is Low German. And now about half of the words that I learned were Plautitsch and half were English, and I had no idea which was which. So when I went to school as a first grader, I was speaking this combination of Plautitsch with English, and the teacher kept saying, now that's not an English word. This is the English word for that. And so I learned basically German before I learned English. Now, even today, there are phrases that still mean more in German than they do in English. My sister and her husband lived in Korea for about 30 years as missionaries there, and they picked up a fair number of Korean phrases that they still use. And when they're talking to each other, they're talking English, but they want to describe something, you use the Korean phrase for this, because that fits better. Now, there's one particular phrase in Plautich which says that, and I won't give you the Plautich version of it, but in English it translates into everybody knows how to handle their own junk the best. And so, you have things around that you know how to work, somebody else comes in, can't make them work, and so on, and you know how to do this. Well, I think that this is a little bit of what Jesus is doing here, is that when he is using Talitha Kumi, this actually is in Aramaic, and what it means is maiden arise, or little girl arise, or this just means more in the original language. Any comments or questions on this? Okay, and then he says, and immediately the girl got up and began walking, for she was 12 years of age. And they were immediately overcome with amazement, and she strictly charged them that no one should know this, and told them to give her something to eat. Okay, we see one thing here that is typical of the healings that Jesus performed. And what is typical of the healing here? Okay, there was no long period of convalescence. All right, you go to the hospital, you go to the doctor, you have something done. I've had a hip replaced almost 2 years ago, and it's still not doing what it should. And so it seems to be coming along, but it's been a long time for this to heal totally. Jesus' healing was totally complete, except for there's one illustration where an individual was blind, and he did something, and the individual says that I see people kind of like trees. And so Jesus did the second healing on him, and then he could see perfectly. And I don't know why Jesus used the two-step method on that, but this was typical of his healing, that it was complete, and he didn't have to, they were able to go about their normal activity. 12 years of age, what's the significance of this? Actually, this was the beginning of adulthood. She was now considered to be a woman. And so she was at this point, see, even Mary, Jesus' mother, she was probably somewhere around 13, 14 years of age. And now in our culture today, to entrust a 12-year-old with a baby is, you probably wouldn't do that, wouldn't want to do that. But she was considered to be an adult, and so she was healed and now could continue on with her life. Yes?
Was the age the same for boys as it was for girls?
Pretty much so. Boys was actually 13. And this is what's the, I can't think of the ceremony that they go through. Yeah, And so you go through the ceremony, and this is that you are now a man and you should take on male responsibilities. So we see that Jesus, and it says, and they were immediately overcome with amazement. And now we see again, and he strictly charged them that no one should know this. So we have the situation of where over on the east side of the Sea of Galilee, when he was dealing with the demon-possessed man, he told that man to go out and tell everybody what had happened to him. But over here on the west side, where there were a lot of Jews, he told them not to do this. And we've talked about this earlier, what might be one of the reasons why he did not want them to be talking about this. Yes, Flora. Okay, he had more enemies among the Jews. That would have been one reason. Anything else?
I think he did not want that spread because of the enemies, but also because he did not want them seeking to kill him.
Okay.
His time was not yet.
All right, his time had not come yet, and so he didn't want them seeking him, plus the fact that there would be such big crowds that would come around that it was difficult for him to teach and to do the ministering that he had been called to do. And so there were two different things and that we have here, two different ways in which he approached the teaching, depending upon what his audience was. Okay, any other comments or questions about Jairus' daughter? All right, then we are going to go back to verse 24 and a half, chapter 5. And a great crowd followed him and thronged about him. Now this is back, he's on the west side of the Sea of Galilee, somewhere around the area of Capernaum, where he had set up his home. And there was a woman who had a discharge of blood for 12 years, who had suffered much under many physicians, and had spent all that she had, and was no better, but rather grew worse. She had heard the reports about Jesus, and came up behind him in the crowd, and touched his garment. For she said, "If I touch even his garments, I will be made well." And immediately the flow of blood dried up, and she felt in her body that she was healed of her disease. And Jesus, perceiving in himself that power had gone out from him, immediately turned about in the crowd and said, "Who touched my garments?" And his disciples said to him, "You see the crowd pressing around you, and yet you say, 'Who touched me?'" And he looked around to see who had done it. But the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came in fear and trembling, and fell down before him and told him the whole truth. And he said, "Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace and be healed of your disease." So we see here that Jesus was in this crowd of people, and that this woman who had had this disease or this condition, and we really don't know just exactly what the condition was, but it was something that she'd had for 12 years. And why was this such a big problem for her? Yes. Okay, she was ceremonially unclean, and for 12 years had not been able to go to the temple. And so this was a real detriment as far as her worship was concerned. And so she had a lot of shame as a result of this. Now, she not only had shame from the condition, but what was the other situation that had occurred to her during these 12 years? not a very complicated situation. She was broke. She had spent all her money on doctors, and whether there were some doctors that were just trying to take her money or whether they actually felt that they were able to help her and were able to cure her, and it hadn't worked. But anyway, she was destitute at this time. And so we see that she was in dire straits. Then she said that if I touch even his garments, I will be made well. She didn't have a real good logical reason for doing this other than that there had been other people that had been healed by coming into the presence of Jesus. And as these people had come into the presence of Jesus, they had been healed, and she had heard this. She had probably even seen some of the people that had been healed, and so she didn't know why or how, but her faith was rather ignorant. But she came just trusting that Jesus would be able to heal her of this. Now, the application that we can make from this is, how many of you know exactly what happened or how your salvation occurred? You don't know just exactly what's the process? What is involved here? How does he save you from your sin? So on. We know the situation that he died on the cross. He was a sacrifice for us and so on. But the mechanism of how this is actually helping us and how this is actually affecting us, we don't know this. And so this lady was really at that same situation. And so she just thought, if there's some way that I can go there and just touch his garment, I don't even need to talk to him. She had that much faith in him. So she wasn't concerned about just how she should do this, but she just felt that if she would go and touch the garment, she could. There is a museum that's close to Magdala. We see Magdala is right in that area. There's a museum there that has a painting that's rather interesting. And this painting is there, and this is the painting of the woman with the issue of blood. And so this is her hand. She is reaching through the crowd of people, and all she wants to do is touch the hem of Jesus' garment. She doesn't want anybody to see her, and it's rather poignant painting that we have of this. And that's how she had faith that something could happen. She didn't know how it was going to happen, how she was going to be able to respond to this, but that Jesus would be able to make her well. And I think that's the same situation with salvation. Now, fortunately, I've been saved for about 75 years. You didn't know I was that old. But anyway, I don't remember. I still remember the incident. I remember what happened. What happened as far as my life was concerned, or how Jesus affected me on this. I can't answer any of those situations. The only thing that I do remember distinctly is that before this time, my bedroom was upstairs. My parents' bedroom was on the first floor. And I would wake up at night, and I would sneak down the stairs, and I would look into their bedroom to see if they were still there. And if my parents were there, I breathed a sigh of relief. I knew that the rapture hadn't come because I knew that they were saved and I wasn't. And so after that time, I had complete peace that Jesus had saved me, and if my parents were going up the rapture, I was going the same way. And so anyway, that's one of the things that I remember about this. But we see that this, she didn't understand what was going to happen, but we see that she had this trust that it could. Now, the disciples said, "You see the crowd pressing around you. Why do you say, 'Who touched me?'" What was the difference between being jostled by all of these other people here and the woman touching the hem of his garment?
I don't know if this is what you're looking for, but the part of that that always kind of hits me, and I wouldn't know how to answer it, is when Jesus responded and said, Jesus perceived in verse 30, Jesus perceived in himself that power had gone out from him. He returned and, about in the crowd. That always, I understand he's sovereign, but the fact that her touching him in faith actually perpetrated a response from him that was physical, where he could actually feel power leaving him because of her touching him and exercising faith.
Okay.
Maybe you have an answer for that, but that's something that I never fully understood other than the fact that it happened.
Okay. So we have the situation of her touching him in faith, and his response was that it cost him something to do that. Now, does our salvation, for each one of us, does our salvation cost Jesus something? Okay, we know that it cost him his life on the cross that time, and so I don't know whether that was a one-time payment for all and that cost him there, or whether whenever an individual now gets saved, whether it costs Jesus something at that time. I think that the salvation, that the cost that he paid on the cross was probably a one-time payment for all. But here he had to pay something for the price that this woman needed to be healed from this. And so he says, "Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace and be healed of your disease." And so, how much faith did this woman have, do you think? Yes, John.
When I first read it, what struck me right away was this woman had faith because all she had to do was touch his garment.
Okay, all right.
To me was strong, the strongest faith.
Okay, so John feels that she had very strong faith because she felt that all she needed to do was touch his garment. She didn't need to talk to him. He didn't need to lay hands on her. He didn't have to bless a handkerchief for her or anything like that, but she had the faith that she would touch him. Any other comments on this? Okay, the faith that she had this faith, but I'm sure that she didn't have the idea, oh, this is really going to be something. I'm really going to feel something on this. I'm going to just be totally healed and be able to go about my life without anybody looking down on me as they had, without anybody keeping me from being able to go and worship in the temple. I don't think that she had that amount of faith, but she had the faith that if I somehow can touch Jesus, that something is going to happen to alleviate the condition that I have. And anyway, the faith that she had, whether it was small or great, was enough. And so the same thing with our salvation. If we come to Jesus and don't quite understand what all is going to happen, we have the faith just to come to Jesus and to turn our life over to him. That is faith enough. We don't have to have tremendous faith as some of the faith healers would have, that if you don't get healed, well, you've got to pray for more faith. No, that's not the situation here at all. So anyway, we see Jesus healing this woman who came to him with some faith, and he also raised Jairus' daughter. How much faith did she have? None. None. Okay? And so we see the difference that we have here and how Jesus worked in these two miracles. Okay, any other comments before we go on into chapter 6? Yes, Dan.
I think probably the biggest part of this in the lady that got healed, and also in Jairus' daughter, is who they had faith in. The object of their faith was the real. That was the point. That
Oh.
was Jesus that they had their faith in, and he was the object of their faith.
Oh.
He was the one who did the healing. And it was two different situations, but still the healing.
Okay, the healing was because of Jesus. We had the woman that had the faith in Jesus, and with Jairus' daughter, it was Jairus that had the faith that Jesus would be able to do something. And even when his daughter died, I think that his faith probably wavered somewhat, but Jesus says, come on, let's go, and we'll see what we can do here with this. And so Jesus was able to operate in two different ways there. Okay, chapter 6 then. He went away from there and came to his hometown. And on the Sabbath, he began to teach in the synagogue. Okay, Jesus had been, got to point at the projector out at the screen. So anyway, Jesus had been in the area around here and up in this area where he talked to Jairus and his daughter and so on. Then it says he went to his hometown, which means that he went over here to Nazareth. He went to Nazareth, and this next portion of Scripture occurs from there. And on the Sabbath, he began. Okay, we have a change here. He had been teaching by the sea because of the very large crowds that we had. Now he goes back there, and he's teaching in the synagogue. And many who heard him were astonished, saying, "Where did this man get these things? What is the wisdom given to him? How are such mighty works done by his hands? Is not this the carpenter or the craftsman, the son of Mary and brother of James and Joseph and Judas and Simon? And are not his sisters here with us? and they took offense at him. Okay, so he went back to Nazareth and met with his family. James is the individual who became the pastor of the church in Jerusalem. He also wrote the book of James. Judas wrote the book of Jude. So we had a couple of Jesus's siblings who did not necessarily believe in Jesus's his ministry and his work to start with, but they eventually came to realize what he had done. It says his sisters are with us, and they took offense at him. Why did they take offense at Jesus at this time? Anyone want to hazard a response? Okay, John, jealousy. Eric. You've got the mic there, please.
So, Jesus is a working man, from a working man's family.
Okay.
Now he says he's a rabbi and is going around and he has his disciples following him and they've heard all these things. And they're just astonished that, the question is right there. They're like, where did he get all this?
Okay.
Because we're no different. He's no different than us. We're no different than him. How is it that he's a rabbi and do all these wonderful things and people follow him and listen to him?
Okay. Okay, it's the hometown boy made good. And they can't figure out how he did this. As I was studying through this, I was thinking, most of you know who Dr. John Pratt is, one of the seminary professors up at Central Seminary. It's hard for me to think of him as a seminary professor. He was our son's best friend from when they were 4 years old. And John and Greg would play in the backyard together. They would load up their golf clubs and go out to the golf course together and spend all day out there hitting balls into the pond and going and catching them. They would go out to the Straight River, Morehouse Park in Owatonna, and go fishing. And they'd spend all day out there fishing. And so it's hard for me sometimes to think of little John Pratt, who was the fishing buddy of my son, now being a college seminary professor. And so part of that is what we see here also. The other thing is that I also think that there was a jealousy about the fact that Jesus was teaching and preaching what the rabbis seemed to have problems with. They would be debating with each other. Gamaliel says this, no, Hillel says that. And so they would be debating this. And Jesus just came right out and said, this is how it is. This is what we have here. And this is the message that we have. And so I think we see some of this with him being rejected. So it says that a prophet is not without honor, except in his hometown and among his relatives and in his own household. In other words, the prophet had honor, but in his own town, he didn't necessarily have that. And in his own home, he didn't necessarily have that. Now, I'm sure that Dr. John Pratt hasn't had his kids, say, oh my, the great Dr. Pratt, so on. He was just daddy. And so we have this, the honor, it's a little different situation. So we have a couple of things here. But the people just, he's a man just like we are. Why is he able to, with all of this authority, speak so authoritatively on these subjects. It says, and he could do no mighty work there, except that he laid his hands on a few sick people and healed them. And he marveled because of their unbelief. And he went about among the villages teaching. So why was Jesus not able to do his normal healing in the area of Nazareth and around there? Grant?
They didn't recognize him for who he was, so there was no faith.
Okay.
And I think that's what we saw in the other cases, even the woman, she exercised, as he said, faith. So there was no faith there.
Okay. Right. There was no faith that Jesus was actually God. This is what he had been saying, that he was God, and the people, or the Sadducees, the Pharisees, and so on, they scoffed at that. They didn't have faith in that. And even the people in his hometown had a hard time understanding this. Now, don't get me wrong. I understand what Dr. Pratt has done and the learning that he has gone through and all of the wisdom, the biblical wisdom that he has, which is much greater than what I have. But still, it's still that little thing about him just being a friend to my son. So we see that Jesus says that he went about the villages teaching, and so these would be the villages in around Nazareth and probably back and forth there. Okay, we will talk about the sending out the 12 apostles, the death of John the Baptist. We will get involved with that next Sunday. Any closing comments or questions? Yes, Eric.
So just about that, I think the best way to interpret that scripture is that it's an
Right. Appreciate that comment. Any others? Okay, we will be dismissed then, and we'll see you next Sunday, Lord willing.